Hey guys, this is Mikro. It's been a been on kind of a soft break from New World, just waiting for Season 4 to drop, and before that drops, I figured it would be a good time to kind of sync back to all the artifacts right now and see which ones are worth grinding if you skipped out on part of the end of Season 4, or if you're waiting for the increased drop rate from 10% to 20%, and you want to see which ones are worth the grind, which ones aren't. This is the video that I would recommend for you, and without further ado, let's get into this. So this tier list is going to be based off the following criteria. It's mostly going to be focused towards PvP because that's where I tend to specialize. So 3v3, OPR, war, those kind of situations. But I will talk about PvE a little bit as well. But in PvE, which artifacts are good is like relatively more straightforward than it is for PvP, and I'll explain that later. So S tier on this is going to be artifacts that are insane for multiple builds. So there are some artifacts that are just very, very good for a large majority of builds, and that's what this S tier is going to be. That they're going to be the most bang for your buck. These are ones you should probably have if you're playing the game actively. A tier is going to be artifacts that are insane for one build, or at least one build. There are some artifacts that are like absolutely broken, it seems like, on one build in particular, and then are less good on other builds but are still viable. And those I'll probably be putting in A tier here. But there are some that are like borderline S tier, even though they are just that, or even though they're mainly used on one build in particular. B tier are going to be artifacts that are just viable for multiple builds but aren't necessarily hard meta. C tier are artifacts that are viable for at least one tier, and then RP tier is going to be those artifacts that you could have in your collection if you really want them to be, but they're just going to sit there and they're not going to be doing much, and they're going to be collecting dust until they get some buffs at some point in time. So starting off here at the top left, we have Unyielding. If you don't know what Unyielding is, it is the heavy helm artifact that comes with a perk that will allow you to receive 20% less damage from critical hits. It also has reduced weight, so you're able to run this with light armor, which is nice. This is often compared to Featherweight. If you haven't seen the video I put out about Unyielding versus Featherweight, definitely check that out. But the consensus from that video after doing everything is this is like an RP tier artifact. There's actually no circumstance where Unyielding is ever better than Featherweight, so it doesn't make sense to ever try to acquire it for any single game mode right now. If the math for how behind the New World scenes change for how crit damage works, then Unyielding could be more interesting, but for now, Unyielding just does not have a spot in the metagame. Void Darkplate is interesting where it's very good and heavy. It's decent in medium as well. It seems like an artifact that overall belongs in A tier. Some people think it's bugged. It's not actually bugged, it just visually is bugged. We've tested that in game and that seems to be working. It allows you to increase your armor by 20%, but if you have armor that is built into the natural skill trees within the game, then it's basically going to add to that, and it's not actually going to be a 20% increase. It's going to be closer to like 16 to 18% for most builds, and that is because of the 200 con bonus, which is going to increase your physical armor, and his 50 con bonus, which is also going to increase your physical armor. The 200 con will also increase elemental, but that 20% is going to add with these, and then that's going to be multiplied by your base. So effectively, it's not actually increasing your overall armor by 20% because it's adding to that bucket first, and then that's being multiplied, which is why Void Darkplate isn't like insanely broken for every single build, but it's still a very, very good artifact. And I think it's like a little bit underrated, to be honest. But that's definitely like A tier at least. Honestly, it's more B tier right now. Like it's good for multiple builds, but it's not like anyone's just like, oh, I just need Void Darkplate for this build. So based off like of how we're doing this tier list, I'm probably going to start that one in B tier, and we'll see how this list progresses and maybe move it up. Magnetic Gauntlets. If you don't know what Magnetic Gauntlets are, you probably don't play Void Gauntlet. You probably don't play Fire Staff right now because it turns out to be very, very decent on Fire Staff and is also very, very good for Void Gauntlet. This artifact is insane for Void Gauntlet. It turns Void Gauntlet from like a very decent class to being absolutely bonkers because it's able to reduce your cooldowns with it. When your cooldowns get reduced on that Void Gauntlet, you're going to be able to or when you crit with the Void Gauntlet, sorry, that's going to reduce your cooldowns because of Refreshing Precision, which will allow you to use more abilities. So you're able to use Oblivion, you're able to use Scream, you're able to use Orbit Decay. You're really able to get a lot of like bang for your buck out of this artifact from a Void Gauntlet user itself, which is what makes it so effective for that class in particular. For every other class, it's not nearly as good, but for Void Gauntlet in particular, it is a kind of a must, and for that reason, it's going to end up in A tier because it's not insane for every build, but if you played Void Gauntlet, it's very good. If you play a Fire Staff that has a Plague Crit setup, then that's also very good for that as well. But those are the two circumstances where Magnetic Gauntlets tends to get the most value. Freedom, this artifact, you just slap it in like half the builds in the game, and it's just awesome. We kind of knew this when it first came out, but it's just usually builds run 3 to 4 freedom. If you run the freedom artifact, then you just don't need to do that anymore. It's fantastic. There is a weird ramification with it where this unending freedom will apply after your freedom effects actually apply based off of how the math works. So it's effectively not going to be 20% value. It's going to be a little bit less than that. But if you are in heavy, usually you just need to run freedom, and then you're set for how much freedom that you need. If you're in medium, you usually need this artifact and one more piece of freedom to get above the threshold that most people are comfortable with. That threshold is around a 45%. That's where you start getting into areas where people can CC chain you, and it's not very fun. But if you get above that, you don't really have to worry about that anymore. And that is where kind of freedom falls. And for that reason, because it's used for so many builds and it's kind of a default slot within the PvP scene for a lot of different game modes. So like War, this is very good. OPR, it falls off a little bit, but it's still very, very solid. 3v3, this gets even better because it counters a lot of cheese builds that are more popular in 3v3. 1v1, if it's a tournament without a ton of rules, this is fantastic. If it's a tournament with a lot of rules, it falls off a bit because a lot of cheese builds are banned in 1v1 tournaments. So overall, like freedom is definitely one that you want to be acquiring, and you can acquire off the PvP track. The Unmoved is a PTR related heavy footwear piece that is going to make it so that you can't be displaced. This is going to make it so that you can't get pulled in from grab walls, you can't be hit by reap. It's not going to give you passive grit, and because it does not give you passive grit, I'm going to go against what people on EU have said here, where they have basically said, oh, this is going to be the best artifact in the game, and I'm going to say this is viable for multiple builds, but I don't think it's necessarily best in slot, because I think it's going to be good versus Great Axe in particular, but it's not going to be as good versus other things. So if you're like a point player in a war, you could see this like potentially getting more value than freedom. If you can't be hit by a grab wall, you can't be sucked in, pulled in, and died. But other than that, I think it's going to fall off a bit, and it's not going to get as much value. Ginge Head Wrap is very, very good for OPR in particular. This will get rid of the dot-based effects that are incoming to you. The Invig passive on this and Shrug Off tends to not be as popular to go down. It's more the Vigor passive that tends to be more popular because that's just more potent in OPR right now. Invig is a problem during war, but most people are like pretty happy with getting to 60% invigorated, and they don't really need to get to that 80% threshold and sacrifice that naturally more heavy class lineup that people tend to run right now. If the meta ever shifts back to medium, I could see this be getting a little bit more value, but for now, since it's not super popular, but it's still decent, I'm gonna say it's viable, but it's like not something that you like necessarily want to go out of your way to get. That being said, it is one of the easiest artifacts in the game to acquire. You just do some like kind of running around in the new zone, you kill some bosses, and it will drop at some point. Nimble Coat, fantastic artifact, great for Fire Staff, great for Life Staff, great for any mage build in the game, great for any build that wants to use a lot of cooldowns over and over. It's just best in slot for PvE, for the Bleed Rapier build. Like, there's so many spots where this artifact is good. Like this, if there was an SS tier on this list, this artifact would probably be in it. But it is just very, very awesome. Ghoul Gloves, this is pretty much just a meme at this point. It unfortunately lacks consistency, and it lacks an actually useful ability. Like if you want to transfer one debuff from you to a foe on a 3-second cooldown when someone is below half HP, like that's super conditional. It's strictly worse than reverse stab on SNS, but it's just not going to be applying very frequently, and because it's like super niche, this is going to end up in RP tier because I don't find it to be viable for any specific build right now. Attuned Leather Pants is very good from a PvE perspective. It's very good for PvP for DPS oriented builds that want to take advantage of that extra stat distribution to get to thresholds that they were not able to get to before. I'm thinking a musket in particular in this example. Bow, this is also definitely viable. There's a lot of classes that definitely could run this that don't run it right now, but it is like a very solid artifact to go, and it is best in slot for a few different builds. And for that reason, I'm going to put it in high A, not quite an S, but I'm going to put it in high A here. I can order this a little bit too. So like Nimble Coat would be above Freedom. Like that's like the highest value artifact in the game probably right now. Attuned Leather Pants would be more valuable than Mag Gloves because it's useful in multiple modes. Void Darklight will very likely be used more than the Unmoved, for example, and both of these are just terrible between Unyielding and Ghoul Gloves, but Ghoul Gloves is definitely worse. Winged Leather Shoes. If you are a PvE gatherer, this is fantastic for you because you can gather stuff and move a little bit faster. If you are not a PvE gatherer, you are never going to see this artifact ever used. So it's a very big dichotomy between being very good for PvE, and I don't think this will be very useful at all within PvP. I know some people that play like a skirmishy style on OPR might get value out of this, but I think other than that, it's not going to get a lot of value. And for that reason, I'm probably going to end up putting this in C tier because I think it's viable for certain circumstances, but it's generally not worth going for. Gray Wizard's Hat. The idea behind this is really cool because you gain extra stats, you gain more mana. Turns out mana is not very useful within New World right now, and because of that reason, it's just going to fall off a lot. It's just going to end up in RP tier. And I think it's a little bit better than Ghoul Gloves and a little bit worse than Unyielding right now. Featherweight, either arguably the best or second best artifact in the game from an all-around user perspective. I think Nimble Coat's used slightly more than Featherweight, but this is the best source of damage reduction for any light player. There's nothing else that even comes close to it. It's just best in slot. The only bad part about this is it comes with physical aversion and it's not super useful, but everything else about Featherweight is fantastic. You are going to effectively, just by running Featherweight, be about 15% tankier than any other light player, which is just great. Like, or I don't think it's actually 15%. Like, it makes your armor about 15% more effective, but it really makes you like 7%-ish more, like at a base value, more tanky, which is just very, very solid. Like, you can't really hate on Featherweight. It's just like very good. And for that reason, because it's used in so many builds, I'm going to put this in S tier as well. I'm going to put this a little bit above Freedom because I think it's used within PvE, it's used within PvP, it's used a little bit more than Freedom is. Freedom is more of a PvP exclusive artifact, but it's very, very good for PvP itself. Quick Draw Gloves. This is a new artifact that's going to be coming out that makes it so that you're immune to damage for half a second when you swap weapons, and it's on a 12-second cooldown. So if you don't swap weapons a lot, like say you're a life staff and you don't typically swap to your rapier, this could be interesting for you, but I think it's going to be a little bit clumsy to actively want to trigger. Like, a lot of people will just swap to rapier for a second and then kind of evade away, or they'll well, I guess you can't evade right now, but you know, like they'll try to move away, and that is like the spot where those might accidentally proc, and then you won't have it for an actual fight. It does come with refreshing, which is nice. Freedom is not a bad thing to have at all in light, but I don't see this being like super, super powerful. I think someone will figure out a way to make this like decent so that they can like use it to get an extra half second to escape, and with that extra half second, they'll figure out a way to generate stamina. For that reason, I don't want to put it in RP tier yet, but I'm definitely going to move it into like C tier here, below, or above probably Ginge, below the Unmoved. It's going to be like viable, but I don't see it being like super, super overpowered at the moment. Konya's knee guards is very interesting because this starts out as at 33%. People complained about it not being useful and the devs nerfed it to 10%. From a math perspective, if this is at 10% of a value from a base damage reduction from all ranged attacks, there is no spot in the game where this is ever better than Featherweight. And for that reason, I'm putting this down into RP tier, which is a very, very kind of strong opinion. But off of the math itself, the base damage reduction effects typically get about 1/2 to 3/4 their actual value. If this is valued at 10%, that's going to be like around, best case scenario, 7.5 like percent damage reduction for those particular builds. We were actually looking at a build earlier today in my Discord where it was getting to over 130% base damage, and if you're going to reduce that from 130 to 120, you're doing nothing. You're going to be getting lit up. You're just going to die. So Kona's knee guard, as cool as this sounds, I really wish they didn't listen to the community and like nerf this and made it so it works towards both, because now it's actually not useful towards any build versus before it was like, you know, this could be good versus bow, but it's probably still not better than Featherweight. Now it's like, yeah, this is never better than Featherweight. So this is RP tier just off of the math standpoint. If they increase from being a 10% value to like a 15% value, I think it's interesting and it's probably viable then, but at 10%, I don't see this being ever better than Featherweight, and Featherweight will just be supreme for that slot. If you don't have Featherweight though, like it is viable to use that, but like you should be getting Featherweight. Like Featherweight's just way better in every single game mode basically. Tumbler Feet Wraps is an interesting artifact that allows you to gain Fortify and Empower and a decent sized heal compared to what Shirking Heals is at now, along with like some other decent effects. This is the best on slot artifact for a lot of medium players. It's very good for a lot of light players because it comes with an Empower. It's even been viable in heavy. This is one of those artifacts in the game that's considered to be best in slot. It's viable for a large majority of builds. I'm going to put this above Featherweight, but below Nimble Coat in terms of viability. Actually, I might put this above. No, I'm going to put Nimble Coat above it because I think Nimble Coat's a little bit better in PvE. But from like a PvE or from a PvP standpoint, this is like the most used artifact in the game. But I think Nimble Coat's a little bit more versatile, but both of these artifacts are insane. Featherweight is insane. Freedom is insane. You should definitely be trying to get these ones on S tier. The Butcher is interesting. Best in slot for PvE from a tank perspective because it will apply bleeds. Those bleeds will make it so that your bleed rapier builds do more damage. Super solid there. From a PvP perspective, it is considered conventionally by most tank players to be best in slot, but for any other build, I don't find this really being used a ton. Like for DPS builds, you're going to use whatever artifact comes with your secondary weapon. You're not going to use the sword-related artifact. Like if you have a spear, you're going to be using the Scorpion. If you have a greatsword, you're going to be using Serenity. You don't have room to run the Butcher. It's just not quite good enough. And for that reason, it's going to be put in A tier here, kind of low in A tier. But it's like, it's very, very good, and it is technically best in slot in a couple circumstances, so you have to like kind of appreciate it there. Freya's Francisca is very interesting because this hatchet is like either the second or third best DPS build versus bosses, I believe, within PvE. And then in PvP, it's not used at all. So because this list is a little bit more biased towards a PvP perspective, this is going to end up like in C tier. But if you're talking from a PvE perspective, this is a good artifact to just kind of get at some point. From a PvP perspective, though, the only spot where this has really been debated being viable and has not been run at all is from a healer perspective, trying to disengage from a clump, because they're going to be able to get more social distancings off. You're going to get more berserks off. That berserk will get you grit. The grit will make it so you're less likely to be killed by a monkey ult. Because monkey ult got nerfed recently, I don't really think that tech is ever really worth it. I'm going to put this above wing leather shoes, a little bit below Ginge head wrap, but it is definitely viable. Spark of Mjolnir is never used anymore. Unfortunately, it just does less damage. The secondary effect is like kind of interesting. Mighty Gavel is still not popular. I have not seen this artifact used since the first week Lazarus came out, and I don't think it will really be touched after that. Refreshing Move is not what you want in a Warhammer. You just lose DPS by running this, and because of that, I'm going to end up putting this in like a mid RP tier if we're actually rating the RP tier artifacts. Like, I think, okay, Kona is better than Ghoul Gloves. And okay, Kona is the best RP tier artifact. We need to get that out of the way. Like, it is very close to being good. It's just unfortunately completely outclassed by a different artifact. And you're not likely going to run this in medium. If you ran it in medium, I guess it would technically be possible for that to be viable because featherweight loses value if you're going medium compared to light. But Mjolnir is just not it. Like, you should not be going for that artifact in most modes. The Abyss, on the other hand, is very, very good for OPR. It's very, very good for 3v3. Tends to not be viable at all in War for some reason. Still trying to figure that one out, but I'm pretty sure it's just because the passive just feels awful with the Great Axe is the general consensus, because it will allow you to crit. When you crit, you gain mana. When you gain mana, you do less damage with this. It inherently has an anti-synergy that makes it so that you don't actually want to crit with your Great Axe build, but you want to crit to do more damage, and when you crit, you gain mana, and that's going to lower your damage. So it's like, it's fighting itself, basically. And that's the problem with this artifact, and why it typically only seems to work within OPR. And because of that, like, weird circumstance, I'm gonna put this in like between like a C and a B tier level of an artifact. I think it's a little bit better than Quick Draw. I'm gonna put this in low B. I think it's viable with Fire Staff. I think it's viable with Ice Gauntlet and Void Gauntlet, but it's certainly not fantastic, unfortunately. If you play OPR a lot, this is a very interesting artifact for you. But other than that, I have not really seen this artifact be used a ton. The Bolt Caster. This got changed from being a stun to being so that you have to hit a target 2 times, and then the 3rd time it's going to apply a massive damage effect. I think that inherently makes it not viable, and I'm going to explain why. The reason why I don't think it's viable from a War perspective is if you hit someone twice with this artifact, and I see, hey, I have 2 Bolt Caster dots on me, I don't want to get one shot, I'm going to pop a Cleanse Pot, and the effect is going to go away. So it's good at forcing a cleanse, but I don't see it being super insane outside of that. On top of that, you hit someone twice, right? You want to proc that Shirking Lightning so this like actually does damage, and then you hit someone with it, which inherently makes it very difficult to consistently trigger. And if you're making something that's very difficult to consistently trigger, consistency is typically better within a PvP perspective. And for that reason, I don't think Boltcaster is super viable within a war perspective. Within an OPR perspective, you're most likely, if you're a bow player, you're just lobbing shots down main. You're not really aiming, and you're not going to be doing a lot with this. I think the best spot for this artifact is really counterintuitive, and I think it's from a PvE perspective at doing damage. This is the artifact that's going to be the closest to being viable for that. I think this is a good artifact for trying to kill a tank if they're not blocking for some reason. Like someone that's like really, really stationary, just standing in a clump, that you're not going to have your arrows hit by Maelstrom, which is also sounds like a nightmare scenario. Like, good luck doing that. Because this seems so niche, just like off of what I'm thinking on paper, I'm going to put this artifact not in the RP tier, but in like low C tier. I think wing letter shoes are probably a little bit worse, but like I think people will try this artifact, and within 2 weeks they'll realize this artifact is terrible, and they'll not play it ever again. But there is a chance that this could be viable specifically from like a 1v1 and 3v3 aspect, which is why I'm going to leave it not in RP tier, because it definitely has a spot where it could be used. Maybe I'll move it up a little bit, because I didn't really think about the 1v1, 3v3 aspect, where you're more likely to be hitting your shots. But larger scale, not very good. Smaller scale, maybe okay. The mechanic, it doesn't do damage, but you could use a lot of cooldowns, and it's very fun to play with. Unfortunately, it is like an RP tier level weapon. It just doesn't do damage. Because it has 2 abilities, and those abilities tend to make it so this artifact doesn't do damage. People have tried to make this work. No one has made it work successfully, and people tend to immediately switch off of it after being like, hey, I got the mechanic. This is a cool looking artifact. And for that reason, I'm going to move everything down here. Honestly, it's worse than Mjolnir. It's better than Ghoul Gloves. It's in a solid RP tier. Gladiator here. This is going to probably be the best in slot kind of artifact from a tank perspective, because you're going to be applying a passive bleed, and bleeds are just insane within PvE. But that's only within PvE. Within PvP, you do get 4 perks on this, which is kind of nice. You don't typically get 4 perks on a shield anymore, or I guess 5 technically if you include the passive here. Shield Bash is not really used at all. It's not very useful. A Shield Rush is very useful, but the problem is it's an around shield, so you're probably going to be wanting this in either medium or in heavy for the damage bonus that comes from running around shield, which is around 5%. So it's kind of like awkward. I don't see this being like fantastic, but it's definitely going to be viable. You can put like Enchanted Ward on there next patch, which is kind of interesting, or Enchanted. Like, you'll have some damage option with this. Like, it seems like it will be interesting. I could see it being viable for a few different setups, but I don't see it being fantastic or meta breaking particularly. So I'm going to put this in B tier for now. I'm going to put it a little bit above the Abyss and the Unmoved, but I don't think this is going to be like a game-changing artifact at all. Michael, everyone's favorite shield. It looks very cool. It doesn't do anything, and it's not used by anybody. And for that reason, it's RP tier. There's simply no good reason to use Michael over any other artifact right now. People that have tried to make it work have embraced it as a meme. It is down there with Ghoul Gloves, but I think it's slightly better than Ghoul Gloves. The best part about it is that you can remove 1 debuff after you block. Your stamina will break in about 2 to 3 hits, and then you won't be able to block anymore. You won't be able to dodge anymore, and you'll just cry as you slowly die. If this was on a heavy shield, I think it would be a lot more interesting. But unfortunately, kite shields just kind of suck at blocking in general. The one spot where this is kind of interesting is if you're doing like a flail barrage based build where you technically block when you do some sort of frontal attack. Maybe it could be viable, but I haven't seen it really work out yet at all. And I'm pretty confident in putting this in RP tier. The wall. Fantastic for tank SNS within PvP. Within PvE, I would argue it is very, very good for those people that don't want to do speedruns but want consistency, because this hard counters a lot of the mutations that are existent in the game. Within PvP, this is fantastic because this Chromatic Ward cannot be stripped by Void Gauntlet, and Void Gauntlet is super strong within PvP right now, and Lake will not be nerfed because it's mostly strong in a war scenario and not as much in an OPR scenario because it's just used less. For that reason, it is best in slot for at least one build in the game, so it is going into A tier, albeit it's just really viable for tank. The Wall and the Butcher are here for tanks. If you're a tank player, you probably want these. If you're not a tank player, you probably don't want these. The Inferno. This got buffed recently. They talked about it within a latest dev thing to go from an 8-meter range to a 15-meter range. The problem inherent to Inferno is strength passives suck. To give like an idea here of why strength passive sucks, we could open this up on New World Database if this ever loads, which hopefully it will. But the actual range change on here is going to be nice. The fact that it comes with the strength thing basically means you lose a perk, because you're not going to be doing light attacks with this. You're probably going to be using it for flamethrower. You're not going to be doing heavy attacks a lot with this. You're probably going to be using it for flamethrower. It's not doing physical damage. You don't really care about your stamina. You're going to be getting this off, which is nice. You're not going to be doing a lot of basic melee attacks because you have a ranged weapon. And like at this point, like you've already seen that like none of these bonuses apply. That's the reason why it's not really viable for strength, even though it has a strength-based effect. It is viable from an int perspective. Because it's viable from an int perspective, if you run this with int, you just lose access. You just lose a perk for an artifact slot. And I think this is just generally worse than going pest offhand with the fire staff with the flamethrower. You also can't get plague crits on here, which is super, super powerful for flamethrower-based builds right now, because that can apply all the time and it's not super conditional anymore. I don't think the Inferno is as good as a lot of people think it is. A lot of people have been trying to make this work, though. I will humor that, and I'll put it in C tier, but I don't find it to be very likely to be very good. It does seem like it's gaining a lot of traction in terms of something that people are going to be trying to make work, but it's just, I don't think it's quite there yet. It needs some sort of change to that strength-based passive, because strength-based passives turn out to suck with magic weapons. Vengeance. This is a life staff. It is great for PvE and paper because it'll let you do more damage, and then with that damage you can swap to your Void Gauntlet. Hopefully your group is healing enough and you're just able to out heal everything, do a little bit more damage, get that mutation time down. Very good for anyone that's trying to speedrun. If you're not a speedrunner, this is interesting with the new gems, because you could put a gem in this and try to make something work out of this. I don't think it's going to be super, super successful with that, but it will definitely be tried. I think this is an artifact that is viable for multiple builds, but I don't think it's going to be super, super successful at being played within multiple builds, if that makes sense. The Scorpion Sting. This is an interesting artifact because it's very good with SNS Spear. Like, this is defined like the game on its own, right? Like, it's got nerfed so much, but it's still like, it does something that nothing else really can, and I think it's definitely viable for multiple specs. I don't know at this point if it's necessarily best. You could say it's like, oh my god, this is like best in slot for this specific build that's like terrorizing the game, but it is definitely a little bit more than viable. I think it's like, it's to the point where it's still good enough with enough builds and being played enough where I'm comfortable putting this in A tier, but it's going to be lower A tier because the Wall and the Butcher is like actually best in slot. This is like softly best in slot. Like this and Void Darkblade are like in a very similar position where it's viable in a lot of modes, but it's not necessarily like quite there. I'll humor like the actual tier list and move it down a little bit than A. Like we'll do high B, but like it is very, very close to being best in slot for builds. SNS Spear is fantastic still. It's still used with that a lot. Some people have been trying to cut the Scorpion Sting because the cooldown integrates, but I still think it's fantastic. The Finisher, just very good for a lot of builds in the game. This is used on Healer. It's going to be used on Healer next patch and actually do a decent amount of damage within PvP. It's best in slot for PvE. It is very good for bow, very good for musket, very good for a lot of builds. This is like pretty easily an S tier artifact. This is probably above Freedom. It is, I'd say, a little bit below Featherweight, but because not everyone needs to run like a bleed-based rapier build, it's one of the more complicated builds in the game to run. But it's just very good for a lot of secondaries. If you're like a squishy player, you probably want the Finisher on you. There's not much of a better alternative. Deep Freeze is the best artifact that's going to be released next season. That isn't out right now. It has Chilling End, which will allow you to do 15% more damage to people that are frozen, root, or chilled. So if they're affected by Ice Gauntlet, you're going to be doing 50% more damage in both weapons. Unfortunately, it comes with Wind Chill. On the bright side, it comes with Wind Chill, so we get to see more Wind Chills in the game, even if it's not really doing as much as people would like it to. It comes with the Refreshing Move, which is nice. It's like an interesting artifact, but we really just care about the Chilling End. Because it has Chilling End, and because IG is still so good, this is easily going in S tier here. It's going to be viable for multiple builds for sure. The Life Take, like, it's going to be really good on BB, really good on Fire Staff. Like, we'll see it pan out. But Life Taker here. Life Taker is the Void Gauntlet that looked like it would be really good, was bugged, didn't really do anything. Some people still run it because the rend is kind of nice. The rend has a 1 second cooldown. It's not super consistent to apply. You gain less ult charge because you don't have the dot effect that is applying every single AoE. You have less utility than a different Void Gauntlet, and for that reason, I would prefer a regular Void Gauntlet to the Life Taker. I won't put it in RP tier because I'm a nice person and I've seen this used with Musket in particular to some success, albeit it's very greedy, but it is definitely not something that is nearly as good as a lot of people think it is. The Pestilence, the other artifact that is arguable for best in slot in the game, you'll notice the theme here. These artifacts that are best in slot from DPS perspectives have some sort of passive effect that works on your offhand. This one has Blighted Enchantment, so you're going to be reducing heals, you're going to be applying a disease. Plague Crits is actually very, very good right now. Keen all of a sudden became actually kind of decent on a blunderbuss. Fantastic artifact, one of the best artifacts in the game from a PvP perspective right now. There is not really a lot to hate about this. It goes right up there with Finisher, right up there with Deep Freeze. I'm going to argue that Deep Freeze will probably reign supreme next patch. Finisher will be close behind, because I think not as many people run in BB, but all three of these are just super, super awesome. Serenity, fantastic artifact. If you run Greatsword, you want Serenity. This kind of end of discussion. Good from offense perspective, good from a defense perspective, but if you use this for defense, it's kind of cursed because it's also the best in slot for PvP as an offensive tool. So I wouldn't try to do that, but it is very, very good. It definitely belongs in that conversation. I think it's a little bit less OP from like a PvP perspective than Pestilence, but it is like right up there, like as a very thing that is a very good artifact that is insane. It is good with, so in terms of like builds, because I say multiple builds here, Deep Freeze going to be used on with IG, with VG, going to be used with Fire Staff, going to be used with Blunderbuss. Finisher, used with Bow, used with Life Staff, used with Musket. Pestilence, used with Fire Staff a lot. That is the main one. So I guess by definition, if we only use this with Fire Staff and it's not used with as many builds, this goes into very, very high A because it's very good. Serenity, used with SNS, used with Hatchet. A few other builds I think use it as well, but Pestilence is just not quite in the S tier just because I think it's only really used with Fire Staff right now. It used to be used with BB, with IG a bit. I think IG with BB, you're just not going to run Pestilence anymore. It's just going to be a Fire Staff slot. The effect from Deep Freeze is just too good, so we'll kind of leave that with that. Odo, good for tanks. The passive actually still doesn't work, even though it says it does. We hope it's fixed on the PTR. If it's fixed on the PTR, that would be fantastic. This is viable for a few different builds. Like people have tried Warhammer with this. They have tried mostly Warhammer with this, to be honest. They've tried like Great Axe with it. They just try to like increase the value of their secondary weapon. And like, it's not bad. Like it comes with lifesteal, it comes with a refreshing move. You can't really hate on it. That's like very solid. If you tend to block, like it's very good too, because it's just going to be healing you for a decent amount, not that much, but like a few hundred HP. So it's like good from a solo Q OPR perspective from a tank. Definitely viable on multiple builds. Probably not something that you want to be kind of doing everything in your power to get. But it's more than viable. I think this B tier list is a little bit messed up though. I think Gladiator and the Unmove can be up there. I guess Gladiator could be up there. The Abyss, I think, belongs a bit higher than these, though. I'm going to move these down, move the Abyss up. I think the Abyss is a little bit better than them. Odo, I think, belongs about, like, a little bit above Vengeance, but not much above Vengeance at all. Vengeance is mostly there because of the gem slots, and I think people will try it. Endless Thirst. This has been weird because it's been like, no one really knows what this passive duration is anymore. I think they said it was going to be 25%. It was 20% originally, went up to 40% randomly, and now it's down to 25%. I think that's supposed to be a buff. At this point, I don't know if it's a buff or a bug fix, but I know it's very, very good if you run Focus Pots, because if you run Focus Pots, they have no cooldown, so you can just keep applying that Empowering Toast, keep applying that Fortifying Toast. For that reason, this is best in slot in 3v3, and there's nothing else that will compete with this artifact in 3v3, and for that reason, it goes in low S tier, because it's specifically viable from a 3v3 perspective that is like best in slot. But if you don't, like in every single build, basically, there's no reason to run Ankh in 3v3. This is just better. But if you aren't playing 3v3, I don't think this artifact really gets as much value. If you're doing 1v1s, this artifact gets a lot of value. Anything bigger than that, like it falls off pretty significantly, pretty fast. Blood Drinker, a very interesting artifact that seems like it would be insane. Unfortunately, there's like passive like hit effects that apply to Ghoul's Harmony and leeching, so that you can't really be fully self-efficient off your own. It's viable from kind of an AoE based build that doesn't apply a dot, so I think like Fire Staff that does decent damage, and you'll be able to heal from this, but you're going to be reducing your damage. Void Gauntlet, this is decent. There's not a lot of other builds that it's like super great with, but it definitely like is viable on more than one build. It's just like not sexy, I guess. So I'm gonna put this in low B tier. Lost Stopwatch, the solid cheese build that when the devs realized that this stuns would increase by 1 second, which it used to be double, which this isn't and here, but it's gonna be 1 second. That the bow would be broken because then the bow would stun for a second and a half, and they had to basically gut it to the where they had to change bow to make that one like worse overall, which is probably for the better because it was not going to be very fun to play around. I don't think Lost Stopwatch is like super great anymore unless you are tanking within PvE. For that reason, I'm gonna put it in like low C. Like I don't think you should be. I think the wing leather shoes are getting more value than this. I think light fakers getting more value than this. Both those aren't very good. And last but not least, everyone's favorite artifact in the game, Ankh. Still used in every single mode, is getting nerfed a decent amount, so it's going to be, and pots are getting buffed, right? So you're not going to be wanting to reduce the value of your pots as much. You have to be very heal reliant to use this artifact. I think this artifact is a little bit overrated as of recent. It is like very good, but I don't think it's like as insane as it once was. That being said, it is still better than every other jewelry artifact in the game. Even though I think it's overrated, it's not as insane as anyone says it is, or as everyone says it is. I'm still going to rate this as the best artifact in the game because there's nothing that really is as good as it right now. There are artifacts that are interesting, but I think that these are just the best. So S tier here, there are a lot of artifacts. This is going to cost a lot of dark matter, but all of these artifacts are very good, well, at least on one build, or like on a few different builds. Like Ankh, you'll use this in basically every build. Nimble Coat, there's like at least 3 or 4 builds that use this. Tumbler, you're going to use this in 3 or 4 builds. Featherweight, you're going to use this in like 3 or 4 builds. Deep Freeze is going to be used on a bunch. Finisher going to be used on a bunch. Serenity, a little bit more niche, but it's still used on at least 2 builds at a very high level and in PvE, which is nice. Freedom is just like a default, like very good for any heavy class. Unless Thirst, fantastic for 3v3, fantastic for 1v1, but that is mostly where that lies. So let me know if you guys have any questions about this tier list, or if you think I missed anything, or if you would rate anything different. I know this is a longer video to come back to, but it's something that I wanted to make. I'll put the tier list in the description below so you can like look at stuff. But it overall, it's just there are a lot of artifacts in the game. You don't have time to collect them all. It costs too much gold to upgrade them all. So use your resources wisely. I would try to go for most of the artifacts in this S tier list or this A tier list. Some of them in B tier are viable, like Dark Plate, Scorpion Sting for sure viable, Abyss for sure viable. It's just like a little bit more build specific. C tier, you like really need to be like committed to actually using that to be upgrading that, in my opinion. With that being said, I will see you guys later.